The New York Times reported this week on a two-time violent killer who, upon release from prison at the age of 81, went on to kill again. Wow, tragic. And the killer is a woman, which is both tragic and very unusual. So I'm going to just read the first 5 paragraphs of this article. So this is the New York Times piece this week. How did a two-time killer get out to be charged again at age 83? Marceline Harvey is accused of dismembering a woman in Brooklyn. Her life was defined by a tormented relationship with women and herself, and a simmering anger. This is published yesterday, and here are the first 5 paragraphs of the article. The person before the parole panel in June 2019 was tall and slim, in far better shape than 81 years of life might have suggested. Mild and polite, the supplicant seemed nothing like the murderer who had spent decades in prison, first for shooting a girlfriend dead in 1963, and then for stabbing another in 1985, stuffing her corpse into a bag and leaving it in Central Park. I am no longer that person, the inmate told the parole board commissioners. Despite misgivings, they would rule in favor of release. 2.5 years after leaving Cayuga Correctional Facility, Marceline Harvey was accused again, charged with killing Susan Layden, 68. Part of Ms. Layden's body were found in March inside a shopping cart in East New York, stuffed in a bag. In Ms. Harvey's apartment, investigators found a bloody mop, a tub full of towels, and a box for an electric saw. For 7 decades leading up to her latest arrest, Ms. Harvey navigated New York's intricate criminal justice bureaucracy, the country's largest police apparatus, the state's overlapping welfare agencies, its prisons, and the officials charged with deciding who remains in them. She confronted the system in some moments, manipulated it in others. Behind her was a trail of crimes so grisly that for decades, parole officials refused to let her out. Now Ms. Harvey has pleaded not guilty to murder. Ms. Harvey's lawyer at the Brooklyn Public Defender's Office declined to comment on her case. Ms. Harvey, who was being held at Rikers, could not be reached for comment. She declined an interview request. So that's the first part of a long article of which I will share more shortly. But this is an amazing story.
Very unusual.
Very, very unusual. And so I looked up, I've got the FBI statistics from 2019 on homicides by sex that are single victim, single offender crimes only. So this obviously is not a single victim crime. And I strongly suspect that these numbers I'm about to share would be even more strongly skewed in multiple victim crimes. But I wasn't able, in the short amount of time I was looking, to find multiple victim, single offender crimes. But what I find from 2019, again on the FBI site, is male offenders out of a total of, I don't have the total written down here, but male offenders in, again, single victim, single offender homicides were numbered 5,839, and female offenders were 683, which is actually higher than I was expecting. And when you do the math on that, that's 90%. 90% of single victim, single offender homicides as recorded by the FBI in 2019, 90% had men as the offenders, which makes a female homicidal maniac rather completely unusual.
Well, it's probably much more unusual than that statistic,
as I said.
Right, but because of the definition of homicide as opposed to murder. Mm-hmm. In other words, a justifiable homicide. If somebody is being attacked and they kill their attacker, that counts as a homicide, but not a murder.
Indeed.
And so there may be many. I would guess that is distributed unequally too.
Yes.
I don't know, but
I agree. And of course, I mean, there are a lot of places where you can find statistics, and I went with the FBI. Imagine from before COVID. Just imagine that they would be somewhat clean. I'm sure there are reasons to object to their numbers, as with anyone's, but there you go. Something like 90% of homicides with one victim and one offender are done by men. But if we go back to that article, here we go. If we go back to the same New York Times article, and I'm reading here from a PDF so that I could highlight some. The very next paragraph says, decades worth of police documents and court records detail the life of Ms. Harvey, a transgender woman who transitioned at some point after her release from prison. Central to her tale are more than 3 decades of parole board minutes obtained through the state's Freedom of Information law. In them, she insists that authorities exaggerated evidence, changes stories about crimes she admitted, and veers between a contrition and blaming those she killed. The records include several examples of her harassing or attacking women throughout her life. She was accused of attempted rape at 14. The victim was an 8-year-old girl. Ms. Harvey, who by her own account struggled with her mental health, said she had to choke down rage when women challenged her manliness before she transitioned, making fun of her soft voice, for example.
Talk about burying the lead. This is unbelievable. It's the same damn pattern that we have discussed before obviously the context is entirely different, but Chelsea Manning, who was Bradley Manning, the crime for which she was imprisoned happened in her male form. She transitioned afterwards. So even if you give full credit to the idea that a person can transition from one gender to the other, there is still a historical fact, right? What Chelsea Manning did had nothing to do with giving secret documents to WikiLeaks, right? Bradley Manning did that. And in this case, the person who engaged in the crime for which she was incarcerated for all those years, crimes was a man.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And frankly still is. This is bullshit, yeah. Right? And a considerable risk of being a broken record on this topic. How is this kind? Who is this kind to? How is this compassionate? Who does it serve to pretend that sex isn't real and that violence against women by a man who was engaged in violence against women his entire life is in fact violence perpetrated by a woman? No, the only possible crime that this homicidal maniac has committed that could plausibly, and I think that would be a stretch, but could plausibly be suggested to have been performed by a woman, by a trans woman, is the last one after the release from prison, at the point that the person was already in their 70s, I believe. This is total incoherence. Yeah. It's farce, and it's tragedy, right? It's tragedy and farce at the individual level, at the justice level, and at the society level. So, well, and we are seeing, and there are a lot of ways that we will be mocked for saying that this is one of the canaries in the coal mine, that this is one of the horsemen of the apocalypse. But this is the way that the West falls. Everyone, every child, and every adult knows that sex is real and that sex is binary, and that however you decide you want to express yourself doesn't change what you are.
I would add to that the behavior of the New York Times in obscuring that fact and pretending that there is a different fact which is not even logically coherent is the equivalent of a journalistic crime. Right? Yes. This is, as we always point out, the supposed paper of record. And the point is, this isn't any sort of record. This is a fairy tale being presented as the record of something. And I would point something out. To the extent that all adults, all reasonable adults, understand that there are differences between males and females, think about the consequence of pretending that one can simply transition by saying I've moved from one category to the next. Mm-hmm. What does that do to the statistics? Well, one thing it does is the number of murders that are perpetrated by women is going to go up, right? Now, those aren't murders perpetrated by women, right? At most, they are murders perpetrated by trans women, but the point is, whose bill do they go on, right? Is there a problem with women becoming more violent? No, there's a problem with men saying that they are women and remaining violent, or something like that.
Obvious prediction, which I am certain would be borne out. If the FBI, for instance, started collecting data on gender is the wrong frickin' thing to be using here. Yeah. But homicide by offender, male, female, trans woman, trans man. Obviously, what you would have leading the way would be men and trans women, with women, proportional to their representation in society, below that, and trans men probably lowest of all.
Yep, that's an important prediction.
Yeah, and we are just. It's not even like we've been in like a relay race and we're like passing the baton to the next country that wants to pick it up. We're pretending the baton never existed. We're pretending all sorts of things about who we are and what we are and how life works that is rendering us, like I said, farcical. We look ridiculous because, even at this point, we'll talk a little bit shortly, but, even the very liberal, famously left-leaning countries in Scandinavia are now pulling back from a lot of this gender insanity. They are, and again, we'll talk. America is just like remaining staunch. We are remaining staunch in our deep confusion.
Yeah, and it is, as we have pointed out, it is a revolution that is it is probably emerging from academia, which is bizarrely taken over by particular false notions and has increasingly been so over decades. But this is now taking over the sciences. As I somewhat famously said in Mike Nana's documentary on the Evergreen Affair, this has spilled out into all of civilization. We have activist district attorneys refusing to charge people for crimes, basically blaming society for their bad behavior, etc. But there's also, a couple things are true. One, the ability to even say what is true, right? You could say hypothesis, men and women are not substantially different, right? But then you make it impossible to test that hypothesis if you confuse the question of who actually is male and female, right? So that's what's happening at a statistical level. But there's also a way, there's something in this story that comes from a very different thread, something that's bugged me for literally decades.
I do have more to share about it too, but go for it now.
All right. When we deal with punishing people, right, when we imprison people, ought to be defining two categories. Some people can be rehabilitated. We ought to take the possibility of rehabilitating them very seriously, and we ought to invest in the structures that actually succeed in rehabilitation, whatever they may be. It's a discoverable answer. And then there are lots of people who aren't rehabilitatable. They are psychopaths in the worst case, right? Why did this person get out at all? Right? Crimes that grisly certainly suggest that somebody is beyond indifferent. Maybe they delight in murder and dismembering. And so the point...
And rape and sexual assault.
All of these things. So the question is, even let's say that there was a 10% chance that person was rehabilitatable and that they somehow violate the trend that we know from so many other psychopaths, right? There's no reason to think that that's a category, but let's say it was. It's still not worth risking other people's lives on that gamble. They've done enough to justify keeping them away from civilization for the rest of their life. Why was this person even eligible to be released, given that as far as we know, modern psychology tells us a psychopath cannot be rehabilitated. So why are we pretending otherwise when it comes to our legal system?
Well, to be fair to the New York Times, this is a point they make. Now, they're deeply confused about what the sex of the homicidal maniac in question is, and they claim that that's a difficult question to think about, but that the real question, which is simpler, is exactly the one you just raised.
Okay.
Just a few more bits from the piece. Quote, a homeless shelter worker and people close to Ms. Layden questioned whether, despite her gender identity, Ms. Harvey should have been placed in a homeless shelter for women, given her history of attacking and murdering them. Speaking from Rikers to the New York Post, Ms. Harvey referred to herself as having two personas. One, a violent male named Harvey Marcelin, the name she used for most of her life and is included in court records, and the other, a soft-spoken woman named Marceline Harvey.
So,
born in 1938, Ms. Harvey spent her youth in New York, wrong, the child of a single mother. Even as a teenager, she displayed a propensity for violence, particularly toward women, and had a complicated gender identity. Who the fuck cares?
Yeah.
Sorry. According to court records and parole board minutes, Ms. Harvey, was treated at Catholic Charities, which paired clergy and lay people with troubled children, after the attempted rape at 14. Now, that paragraph I was obviously adding a lot of editorial commentary while I was reading it, but that paragraph on its own, ending with was treated at Catholic Charities after the attempted rape at 14, makes her sound like a victim. At the time, this was Harvey, a 14-year-old violent young man who attempted the rape of an 8-year-old girl. This is journalistic malpractice. As a young adult, Ms. Harvey, described then as a tall, slender man, lived with her mother and earned not described, accurately observed to be, not described, wrong. Like none of this makes sense. In early 1963, Ms. Harvey was again accused of rape, this time as a 24-year-old. This time as a 24-year-old man, they should say.
Right. And
it goes on and on and on.
The problem here is even to the extent, right? And I always bend over backwards to do this correctly, though. I think at some level they've jumped the shark. It falls under my rubric of you don't have to take sophistry seriously.
That's right.
But the fact is, right, if we say gender is the software of sex, right, that only goes so far, right? That linguistic trick they played there with the rape, the attempted rape at 14, where because she is described as female, she is the presumed victim in that paragraph.
Right.
That is not about software, right? The fact is, it may not be impossible for a woman to rape a man, but it is certainly much less probable at the level of morphology, right? The fact is, an intromittent organ is not a matter of opinion. It is something that is either present, right, and therefore can be weaponized, or not present. And the point is, the New York Times years later doesn't get to pretend that that's nobody's business because it was apparently central to the incident.
Just point of order, biology speak may not be everyone's language. And you did not say intermittent organ, although that is one possible interpretation of what in fact the organ is as well. Intromittent organ is an organ that can penetrate and is a penis, or if you happen to be a squamate, if some of our listeners are in fact snakes or lizards, hemipenes, 2 of them.
I don't think we have that many squamates listening, but
I hope
could
so.
be wrong.
I mean, maybe some of our listeners have squamates attending to them.
That is possible.
Yeah,
that is possible.
So intromittent organ is what you said, and it's not a matter of opinion.
It's not a matter of opinion, and in fact, the question of what prison to send you to. Got a penis? No women's prison under any circumstances. I don't care how you dress. I don't care how many shrinks have diagnosed you. The point is, that's a hazard to women, right? You know, if you've had it removed, we can talk about whether or not you just decided you were a woman or, you know, that's a long-standing issue. There's at least a question then. But no, if you are an intact man, the idea of being sent to a women's prison because it's how you say you feel, what universe have we landed in? That's insane.
This is actually relevant. If you put my screen back up again, Zach, this is a picture from the same New York Times article. This is Marceline Harvey, the supposed woman who has committed all of these terrible crimes. Check out that trans woman pattern baldness she's got going on there. I mean, that is quite something.
Yeah.
I'll bet too. I'll bet there are other problems she's having. Maybe hearing loss, typical of older trans women. I'll bet she doesn't quite have the bone density loss that older trans men are often finding themselves afflicted with.
Yeah.
You know why? Because these are anatomical and physiological descriptions of what happens to men and to women as they age. Men are far less likely to experience bone density loss as they age, osteoporosis and such, and women are far less likely to experience male pattern baldness and hearing loss, especially at the higher frequencies. So, you know, just look at the hairline. In addition to everything else about this person, again, a homicidal maniac by every definition, and know that this is not a Marceline, despite the fact that he decided to switch the order in which his names go.
Well, the New York Times clearly demonstrates that they are just simply suckers because this person's history demonstrates that there is a complete absence of moral constraint.
Yep.
If somebody has a complete absence of moral constraint, enough that they can murder and dismember other people multiply, then we are talking about somebody who might find lying not that big a deal. Right. And, okay, right. So this person is lying.
Yep.
Even in the case that they're not, somehow that this is an accurate report from inside, this person has denied other people their entire lives and done so apparently in cold blood.
Yes.
So, yes, I would assume that this person is probably lying. And if they're not, the injustice done by not taking their stuff seriously is a tiny one compared to the injustice that they have done, and they're intact and everything. It just, the story is absurd. You know how I used to say certain stories diagnose the system?
Mm-hmm.
This is one such story.
I believe so too. Yeah. And that's actually a perfect place to end and to segue into talking about Tavistock, but first, just two more short quotes from this New York Times article. Ms. Harvey, quote, presented as a mild-spoken, very tall black man, said Anne Brennan, the nurse who ran the intake. I said, well, why are you in the women's shelter? Apparently, quote, apparently his feelings and identity were far more important than all the other women that were terrified of him, she said. And next thing we know, there's another woman dead. So this does feel a little bit like the moment when a lot of people woke up when, what's his name, who won the swimming competition pretending to be a woman?
Leah Thomas,
yeah. Where just the pictures made it so clear. And there was no violence here. There was injustice, but there was no tragedy at the level that we see here. But it was really patently clear when you just put the visuals and the story in front of people. Right. So let us hope that that this wakes some more people up.